Story 1. Policeman at the front door. I am afraid your wife and daughter were in a serious car accident. December 2024. They both lived. My wife is home, but my daughter is still in the hospital. My wife needs a walker to move around the house. My adult daughter has begun walking again. Story 2. I got pulled over for running a red light while I was drinking and driving. I knew from that point that everything would go wrong, and it did. I lost my job and struggled to find employment for a year due to not having a car during the 12-month ban. My insurance rates were extremely high. I ended up homeless because I could not pay my rent. I developed a short-lived opioid habit while I was homeless. I managed to get back on my feet around 15 months later. I realize now that it was a terrible thing to do. Thankfully, no one was injured. Story 3. Not as serious as life-changing, but I was working in the wastewater field as an operator for the night shift. We are a fairly large plant with a maximum capacity of 66 million gallons per day, and we received 3.5 inches of rain in an hour. After battling the storm, we were recording approximately 250 to 260 million gallons of flow, far more than the plant could handle. About 4 hours went by, and by God, it was holding, but it was very touch and go. I was debating whether to call senior management for advice when the storm started to let up. The other crew member and I grabbed a quick bite to eat and prepared to perform some auxiliary maintenance, which was a saving grace for us. All of a sudden, lightning struck the main treatment building, which uses membrane filtration. All the systems and pumps went haywire, with flows being diverted, and many of the safety measures we had in place, such as backup generators and baffles, were all damaged. A call to management sent the entire auxiliary staff into the building at 2 a.m. Maintenance, laboratory staff, management, and other operators to clean up the severe flooding throughout the building. The moment the lightning struck the building, I thought, well, we're in trouble. Story 4. I was high as a kite all alone after alienating everyone who cared about me. I sat in a drug dealer's house that I lived in after being thrown out by my family, and the drug dealers were the only people who would take me in. Then I realized that they were just using me for the minimum wage that I earned to feed their drug selling, giving me just enough to keep me dependent. The dawning realization of what a complete waste of a human being I was at that time and just how much I had let my mom, dad, and brother down. Story 5. I was 26. I had been knocked back by my preferred career choices in the armed forces, experienced a breakup with my then-girlfriend, had well and truly burned out at my job, was living in a cramped, freezing apartment with an illegally connected gas fire, and my mother was sick. I moved back home to take care of my mother and ended up getting a succession of some of the worst jobs I have ever had. For instance, I was picking up litter at a racetrack and working as a temporary employee in a poorly managed credit center when I was not living on unemployment benefits. The main highlight in my life at the time was the family dog. My mother was not as fond of the dog as I was, which was evident at times, and when I was back at the family home, it was great to pamper that pooch again like old times. I would take her out for long walks, play with her, cuddle with her, and share my dinner with her. If anything, she was the one who helped me rather than the other way around. Life got better after I went back to university for a year and pursued a different career path, but that year when I was 26 was my lowest point. The dog passed away 5 years later at the age of 15. By chance, I was living at home again at that time prior to a move to a different city. It has been many years, and I still miss her. Love you, Kana. Story 6. Going 30 miles per hour down a canyon road on my longboard when I hit a rock, which threw me from the board. I attempted to run it off and just remember the feeling as the heel of my foot hit the road and I felt it in my teeth. I somehow didn't break a bone but was definitely concussed, and half of me was road rash. Story 7. When a doctor was describing what was happening to my teenage daughter and said, "And we call that leukemia. She is now an 8-year survivor." Story 8. My fiancée told me, a month before our wedding, that it was over. We were in a long-distance relationship, and I had been preparing to move to her. I realized I had no money, lived at home, had no education, and was stuck in a dead-end job. I was 30 years old. Life was not going in a good direction. Thankfully, I was able to lift myself up, get things sorted, and build a great life. Story 9. I was pushing 30 years old, and I lived in an attic with a unit in the address. My mother said I did not raise you so you could live somewhere with a unit in the address. Story 10. When I was 16, my mother died, and my father abandoned me on the same day. Things already were not great, especially with my father, since he was coming and going. He stole all of my mother's tax refund and used it on drugs, alcohol, and women. He would get high off of my mother's medications, which included things like oxytocin and trazodone, and blamed everyone else except himself. In that moment, everything just went horribly wrong, but it was also a bandage that needed to be ripped off. Looking back on it now, losing both of my parents at the same time is what needed to happen so that my life could move in a better direction. Story 11. I was one of the early severe COVID-19 cases. In March and April 2020, I spent 38 days in the hospital, 16 of those days in the intensive care unit on a ventilator. We all started isolating at home around March 13, 2020. I was spiraling downward, getting sicker and sicker at home, but at that point, I thought it was probably just the normal flu or something similar. However, eventually, it got so bad that I had that little voice in my head that said, "You better call an ambulance for yourself, because if you go back to bed, you may not wake up tomorrow." So I did. The last thing I remember is coming out the back of the ambulance and feeling the wind blow across me. I heard the doors to the hospital open as they wheeled me in. Later in my hospitalization, the nurses joked that when I came in, I tested very positive for COVID-19. My lungs were so inflamed at that point that my oxygen saturation was down to 65%. They battled for the first week I was in the hospital, trying not to have to put me on the ventilator, but it eventually became ventilator or death, so they placed me on the ventilator. I had to relearn how to talk and walk when I woke up. I was on a full-size oxygen tank for about a month after getting out of the hospital. This all happened while everything was still on full lockdown. At that point, I had already survived the worst of it, and I needed to walk to rebuild my stamina and heart, so I went out walking a lot. Between June 2020 and June 2021, I walked around 2,800 miles, averaging 7 to 10 miles a day. I think the longest unbroken streak on my Apple Watch is something like 512 days of closing all 3 of my activity rings. It's actually kind of a bad answer to your question because I didn't really know up front that everything went horribly wrong. I didn't fully realize that until weeks afterwards. Story 12. I dropped out of college and quit my job around January or February last year. I was hanging out with people whom I thought were my friends, but were really just holding me back. All I wanted to do was spend time with them and enjoy getting intoxicated and sleeping with people because it was fun, and I felt good doing it. I soon came to the realization that I had completely ruined my life and future and needed to turn things around. Luckily, I was able to start at a different college in September of last year, and I am still there now, focusing on my studies. I also quit drinking unless it is actually a special occasion like a wedding or a birthday. I cut out all my old friends, and guess what they are doing now? The exact same things they were doing back then. Story 13. I was 24 and had tried to end my life. I was living an alcoholic lifestyle, failing out of school, and had just gone through the end of the most serious relationship of my life. This was all my own doing, and I saw no way to dig myself out of the hole I had buried myself in. I put out a short final message and proceeded to take a great deal of psychiatric medication along with a fifth of whiskey. I have only got flashes of the rest of that night. Someone forcing me to vomit at home, coming to in a hospital setting that I, at the time, thought was hell, attempting to escape hell, being stripped nude in the psychiatric ward. I ended up with a felony charge for my escape attempt. Just getting that at all, given the state I was in at the time, thoroughly wrecked my belief in the justice system. Fearing worse punishment, I accepted a plea deal for a lesser charge. Did that all, with its mandatory expectations, lead to the life I have today? It absolutely did, so things worked out in a way, but it took me another decade and a half to make my life at all something that I could manage. I'm still basically unemployable outside of entry-level menial labor. If it wasn't for some positive impact I have had on others, I would unequivocally state that the suffering was not worth it and that I wish I had succeeded. Story 14. We had a few months of this. Our dog of 12.5 years died of cancer unexpectedly in August. Both cars broke down multiple times, amounting to $10,000 worth of repairs. My mother passed away suddenly from cancer. We literally did not know she was sick until a week before she passed. At the end of November, we had to fly across the country to see her. They found my daughter's tumor after 7 months of going to the emergency room, just a week after my mom passed. She had a 10 by 9 by 9 centimeter tumor. She is now cancer-free, and we are almost done with treatment. We are still traumatized by the weekly crises. It feels like we are constantly waiting for lightning to strike. Story 15. I was called in for a random drug test one day at work, knowing I would fail. I was fired and blew my savings paying bills, bouncing from one bad job to another while I spent a year trying to get my job back. I was hired back for less money and a lower rank when I returned, but I have been back for a year now, all over some marijuana. Story 16. I went to court for disability after falling down a cliff. I was working for the city and was on the job when the injuries happened. The city sent me to a doctor, and he lied extensively in his report, even going so far as to say I was faking my issues. It was so bad that my complaint letter about it was 30 pages long. Fast forward to court, and the court had reviewed my case only relied on the report from the doctor who lied. I instantly knew I was in a difficult situation. The system is beyond broken. Story 17. When my grandpa came to live with us, he interfered with everything and ruined all of our lives while he was there. Story 18. She didn't come home at 10 or 11 or 12. At nearly 1, she came home in a vehicle I didn't recognize, driven by her coworker. They sat out there for another hour before she came into the house. And you know what happened next? Story 19. Woke up in a jail cell. Do not drink and drive, kids. If you are going out drinking, have a plan in place before going out. Luckily, nobody was injured. Story 20. Me failing my second suicide attempt and the recovery process afterward. I lost a lot of friends from it. It really showed who in my life actually cared versus who never did. Story 21. Got an MRI done for my knee to check a lump that ended up just being a small lipoma. The next day, I woke up and my tinnitus was severely spiked. Then, over the next week, normal sounds like the crinkling of plastic, doors shutting, fans, and electronic beeping became louder. My tinnitus started to gain more tones and react to outside noise. I went to a doctor who said she could not see anything wrong with my ears. On the way home, my ears started to burn and itch, but I thought it was from the earplugs I was wearing. I researched a bit and found out about a condition called pain hyperacusis, with many people suggesting to limit loud noise exposure. I made a post a few hours before going to my place of work, asking people in that online community if what was happening sounded like pain hyperacusis. I wanted to know because I worked in a very loud environment, but I got no responses before having to leave. I could not afford to call off, so I went in. I was only able to stay for a few hours before my pain symptoms became too much. On the drive home, I just had this horrible sinking feeling like I had made a major mistake. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, my ears were burning like mad. I have been homebound because of this condition ever since August 8, 2023. I am in hearing protection 24/7 because my ears cannot tolerate noise. Please protect your ears. Story 22. Trump's first election. The day I heard he won the 2016 election, my stomach dropped, and I thought to myself, this is the end of everything. Trump has done nothing in the last 10 years but confirm my feelings and my disgust for the Democrats for being a bunch of milquetoast quislings. Story 23. What I can only describe now as disillusionment after my 5th grade graduation. I walked around after we all had our little graduation party and eventually found my way back to the auditorium. It looked like a bomb went off. My first thought was, what is the point? Cue over 25 years of severe treatment-resistant mental illness. I felt depressed by 6th grade, suicidal since 7th, and developed bipolar disorder at 20, which resulted in my having to drop out of college. Despite all the medications and treatments I have tried over the years, all they can do is slightly take the edge off. Story 24. Trigger warning. Death. Years ago, I had a friend who was extremely attractive but not intelligent. Her parents were detained by law enforcement while she was out of state working. It turns out she had befriended a man who spent a lot of time online. They had an online romance going, and she was sending him photos and sharing her entire life with him. Weeks after law enforcement detained her parents, they made contact with me and asked how much I knew about this online romance. He had been grooming her to commit crimes for him, and she was agreeing to live with him. That was the plan. I was so disgusted that I told law enforcement what I knew for sure, and I ended my friendship with this woman. Her parents forced her to stop communicating with him. I had to write off thousands of dollars spent on starting a small business with my former friend because I couldn't trust her after she wanted to be the girlfriend of a violent felon. Her parents were traumatized, and the man from the internet was eventually arrested and put in federal incarceration. My former friend died from an overdose, a combination of mental issues and her inability to deal with reality. Life went on, but a dream was destroyed. Story 25. In 2020, we had just bought a house when COVID-19 hit Europe. Debts, lockdowns, and my husband almost lost his job, which was not related to COVID-19, and did lose his promotion. He got seriously depressed, and part of his hair literally turned gray from anxiety and stress. I lost my health insurance and developed stress-induced gastritis. We had been trying for a baby since October 2018 and had to pause that. It was a dark and difficult time. He still has his job and now has his promotion. We are still renovating the house and welcomed our second baby in November. However, that chapter definitely cost us some years of our lives. Story 26. I lost my job and then learned that evening that my mother had been going into work and sitting in the parking lot there every evening because she, at the time, had lost her job months before I lost mine. Out of anger and spite, and with the job opportunities drying up in my town, I moved out. That was in September of 2018. A couple of years later, my world fell apart. I became homeless for the first time and had to move in with my estranged father. He passed away from heart complications. My mother moved back in with me, but we lost the house due to an ex-roommate. We lived with an abusive drug user boyfriend of hers until 2024. Then, when we kicked him to the curb, we made the mistake of taking in the same ex-roommate and lost another house, becoming homeless again and having to move back to our old hometown. Story 27. As a worldwide time when everything just went horribly wrong, on and after January 20th when the executive orders started that ended our republic. On a personal level, when my first wife received her diagnosis of stage 4 cancer, all the overtime I had worked for money to buy things felt worthless compared to the time lost that I could have spent with her. Story 28. When my relative convinced me to sell my house and run away, he stole my money and left me homeless and in deep debt. It has been a few years, and I am still paying it off, kicking myself every day for trusting. Never trust anyone, even your family. Live and learn. Story 29. When my dad, who was driving under the influence, told 12-year-old me to take the wheel, we hit a patch of ice just when he convinced me to, and we crashed into a pole. We're both fine. He has gotten a bit better with his drinking. Luckily, the only things lost that night were a 4th-generation iPod and a van in poor condition. Oh, and I guess my excitement to learn to drive has remained unfulfilled. I still haven't learned, and I'm 24. Story 30. At 14, I was in bed one day when I realized just how much of a mess my life is. Most of it is either my fault or something I just have to deal with. Things have gotten slightly better since then, but are still bad. I should have realized it on Christmas, but it didn't happen until about a month later. I just don't feel joy anymore. Story 31. Somewhere around my 3,000 job rejection, things went to hell long before that, but it took me that long to admit to myself since I have always been a stubborn one. I graduated in a field that had just abruptly folded at the start of the recession, the nasty one in the 1980s, with no other real skills. I tried to apply for just about everything, but not even minimum wage jobs would hire me due to being too overqualified or lacking experience. I retrained 3 times for different things and managed to land a call center job for a help desk, only for the company to go under twice with 2 different companies. I quit the third just ahead of being fired for doing my job and helping people instead of ripping them off by upselling payment insurance plans that were nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. Finally, I gave up. I have been retired for 20 years now and am doing better than I was. That is for sure. Story 32. The day my wife and I found out our unborn son had Down syndrome certainly felt that way. Felt like the world was spinning around us for days on end. We adjusted and he is doing great now. He took his first steps on Sunday. Story 33. I was pulled over with marijuana in my car in a non-legal state while under the influence. I knew that was going to go poorly, and I was right. Story 34. My husband died 1 week to the day after our wedding, after we had been lovingly, happily, and monogamously together for nearly 13 years. The world and my life ended for me that day. Story 35. About 15 years ago, I went into medical bankruptcy. It basically ruined my life. A couple of years after that, I was on my way home via subway when I got knocked out. There was a knockout game trending at the time where people knocked out random individuals. I woke up in a hospital, and my face was in nearly unbearable pain. I also had a number of bruises and scrapes. Medical bankruptcy is traumatic. Even today, I fear going to the emergency room due to the potential costs. If I have to go through medical bankruptcy a second time in my life, I may consider ending it. This was the immediate mindset I had when I woke up in the emergency room. I had an intravenous drip and a series of monitors on me. A doctor and a nurse came to talk to me. I immediately said that I needed to leave. They brought another doctor and a nurse over to plead with me to stay. I told them that I was not insured and looked the doctor and nurse in the eyes, asking if they were going to pay for it. I left shortly after that in a lot of pain. Life generally became difficult after that. I was absolutely paranoid and wouldn't leave my house unless I had pepper spray and a knife, which might be considered normal, but I would walk in broad daylight, ready to confront anyone who tried to mess with me. There was absolutely no way I could pay for therapy at that time, but eventually, I saved up enough money over the years and dealt with at least half of the trauma. I no longer walk in public feeling paranoid that someone would bother me in any way. No pepper spray and knife, but I keep pepper spray in my car. But I also trust only a handful of friends now. I've put off addressing the original issue that sent me into bankruptcy because trying to determine what my issues were resulted in medical bankruptcy. I do need to go back to therapy again since I saved enough money for 16 sessions of copayments. Story 36. I once started a company with 2 other partners selling industrial paint all over the world. After a few years, the business was doing great. My girlfriend was just hired to be a sales agent for Eastern Europe and moved there when I found out that one partner had a gambling addiction and told me just before the end of the fiscal year he had lost over 120,000 euros. Then I discovered the other partner set up import companies in different countries with our partners we worked with and was sending half the money to accounts I had no access to. When confronting him and telling him to leave the office, he hit me and left me with 5 teeth gone in a pool of blood. My neighbor found me. The funny thing is that we agreed to all have very low incomes to invest as much as we could into the company, so I was on a full student loan at the time. Also, one of the partners was my best friend, so I was foolish to put nothing in writing, just postponing it to sort it all out one day. I lived above the office, but was escorted away by the police and ended up at my parents' home 200 kilometers away. When I told my girlfriend she would not get paid and explained the situation, she, of course, left me. So I was left at my parents' house, lost my company, lost my teeth, lost my house, lost my girlfriend, and gained a debt. It was not my best day. Story 37. When I started getting texts to call someone and they ended with a heart, that person told me the person I loved had killed themselves. This was 2 weeks into getting a new job that had me working on the road seasonally for 5 to 6 months at a time. It was really good money and it was about building the future I had envisioned. I still have a lot of guilt and anger over this. I had a mental breakdown in a field outside a capital city in the light rain. Anyways, that was April 2023. I am still working on fixing my mind and getting back on track. The worst thing is it haunts you. You don't even think about it, but it's there. When you first wake up, when you have idle thoughts always in the shadows. Also, it is shocking how everyone abandons you. No one is ever really there for you. I lost friends and became estranged from my siblings. That is really shocking how people push you away subtly just for being a victim of trauma. Story 38. Just by chance, I noticed the realtor's paperwork showing that the childhood home my daughter and I had been sharing for the past 20 years with my widowed mother was on the market, with not a word from my mother to forewarn us that she was thinking of selling. We had 5 weeks to find a place to live with pets, pack, and move out. My daughter was in the middle of final exams in her 3rd year of university. I had just started a new full-time position, but I was in training, so I was trying to get up to speed with my colleagues while living with nonstop anxiety. I spent the first couple of weeks trying to get my mother's doctor to conduct lucidity testing on her, talking to lawyers to get the sale stopped, and speaking to the realtor to explain that my mother had memory issues and mild brain damage from numerous past transient ischemic attacks, all to no avail. My mother arranged for movers to pack her up early to bring her belongings to her new retirement community, but she conveniently forgot all the appointments she made with the downsizing company she hired to deal with the 40 years worth of items she left behind. So, I ended up having to deal with her belongings as well as what my daughter and I had accumulated over the 20 years of living in our cherished home. It was a living nightmare for 5 weeks. I slept about 4 hours a night on a good day, sorting through belongings, packing, looking at places, and trying to sell everything left behind. As much as we have lived in some nice places since that difficult move 17 years ago, I am still waiting for something to feel like home. My heart has not found it yet, and I am sure I have post-traumatic stress disorder from that experience. Story 39. When I was molested at gunpoint and the police did nothing, I had to gather the closed-circuit television evidence myself using data protection laws. It was serious to catch the man responsible despite his long history of similar offenses and being on probation at the time. I have post-traumatic stress disorder and severe psychosis because of it, but he is now an amnesiac who forgets who he is every 5 minutes, so he got what he deserved. Story 40. When I decided to take a postgraduate degree, I didn't do enough research and didn't realize I had to pay the tuition fees myself with the postgraduate loan. I just assumed it worked the same way as the undergraduate student finance, where you take it out and the tuition fees are paid automatically for you by the loan company. Instead of telling my parents that the postgraduate loan money was to pay for the postgraduate tuition fees, I foolishly kept my lack of research a secret. So I started the degree, and I quickly ended up running out of money. Now, most people would think the obvious thing to do would be to get a job. However, I mistakenly decided I didn't need a job and that I could manage on barely anything. Eventually, my parents found out towards the end of my degree, and I found myself in a panic to find a job because of my little income. Because I had no work experience whatsoever, no employer wanted to take me on, and it took me months to find anything. When I did finally get a job, it was only part-time. Thankfully, my finances are much stronger now, as I have a full-time position, but that was one time in my life when everything had gone disastrously wrong. Story 41. Without so much emphasis on the life part of the question, just this morning, I called about a rejected loan application to understand why I had outstanding approval odds. It was because I was flagged on my current loan with them due to being in a debt relief program for one of my credit cards. They included all my debts in their program, including the current loan, not to mention that I had canceled that program already. I was relying on that loan as it would have freed up all of my credit card debt and provided twice as much money in my monthly budget. On top of that, there still would have been a large amount of the loan left over. All of my current money problems would have been completely resolved, and I would have had money left over for myself. Additionally, I would still have been able to pay all my obligations with further money remaining. Story 42. Sobering up and realizing that I was in a hospital bed in the emergency room. There was a man sitting in a chair in the doorway, so I couldn't leave, and a mobile toilet in the room, so I had no reason to leave. I had vague images of the night before and pieced together that I was waiting to go to the psychiatric ward. I looked at the time and realized that I should be at work, but clearly that wasn't happening. Neither my partner nor my best friend would answer their phones. I had no missed calls or texts from either of them. I had visible injuries on my arms and couldn't quite discern if I was still drunk or not. I realized that whatever I had done the night before had been catastrophically bad and I had nowhere to go and no plan. It was sober up or lose it all. Ice Age was playing on a television in the room, and someone brought me a breakfast tray with a lot of cantaloupe. I realized I was in a hospital gown and had no idea when that happened. I would later learn that a medical worker had gotten me out of vomit-stained clothes, and I bit them in the process. At the time, biting was a pretty common behavior of mine during the post-traumatic stress disorder flashbacks. The next few weeks would be a somber time between psychiatric treatment and rehabilitation, followed by months of rebuilding, apologizing, and quiet. Story 43. 7 years ago today was that day. My dad had died during his morning run, and it was difficult to navigate life after his passing. Story 44. I was on a solo camping trip, trying to find myself or whatever, when I decided to cook dinner over a campfire. I was feeling pretty proud of my survival skills until I realized I had set my tent on fire. In a panic, I tried to put it out with the only water I had left, which was also my drinking water for the next 2 days. The tent was a goner, and I was left with a charred mess and no shelter. I spent the night in my car, contemplating my life choices and wondering if I should just stick to glamorous camping. Story 45. Abdomen pain, more than 20 inconclusive ultrasounds, 2 traumatic emergency room visits, waking up in a pool of my own blood. I had an ectopic pregnancy that had ruptured and had been bleeding slowly internally for 2 to 3 days. I lived, but I will never mentally be the same person who walked into that first emergency room. Story 46. Finally broke up with my abusive ex. I decided it would be better to be homeless than in danger. I made pretty good money. I could live in my car until I could afford a security deposit on an apartment. I decided to try out longboarding. I broke my ankle and was put out of work and homeless. Story 47. I had gone a couple of days without eating, which wasn't too unusual for the time, and I decided to eat a Pop-Tart. I put it in the toaster and stared at it. The next thing I knew, it caught fire. I didn't know how to react, and my dad wasn't home, so I threw a glass of water on it. It was fine. I wasn't allowed to use the toaster after that. I was 19 years old. Story 48. That one time I tried to push a pull door with full confidence. Or when I confidently hit reply all on an email and instantly regretted it. Story 49. When I found out that my cheating ex-husband had proposed to his now spouse while we were still married, I just sat there, stared at their Facebook post, and cried. I realized it was really over, that everything I had based my entire adult life on from the age of 18 onwards was a total lie. And I have to say, that hurt. Story 50. I had a 2-week vacation in an inpatient psychiatric unit after too much stress caused my brain to shut down for a bit. At the same time, I was diagnosed with a chronic physical health issue, which felt like a double whammy. Story 51. I was arrested in an African country where the wheels of justice famously turn painfully slow on suspicion of being a terrorist. Even though I was innocent, people spend years in prison there just waiting on a court date. Story 52. A sudden health diagnosis or a serious accident can be a moment when someone realizes that everything has changed, prompting a reevaluation of priorities and life choices. Story 53. Once I got pulled into a military interrogation room after I cut off an ex-friend I was living with. We hadn't spoken in months and had no clue what was going on as I was being led to the building by my command. Even though my intuition told me it was due to the friend. He had been too quiet. Then the agents came into the room and said they received a phone call about some serious accusations from a civilian. I told them I bet they already know who it is, which was my first mistake. I was a week away from getting out of serving 6 years in the military, and he knew. The next day, I checked my date of separation in the system at work, and it had been changed from a few days away to indefinitely government investigation. That's when I knew. Story 54. When my stepmother started packing her bags and yelling at my dad, who was live streaming the entire thing, I honestly did not think that would be the day when my trust issues, anger issues, anxiety attacks, eating disorder, and depression would begin. Story 55. Never had that. Had a few moments where I wondered what I just got myself into, most notably getting off the bus at the Regional Transportation Center in Great Lakes. Story 56. I experienced a moment of distress after using cannabis. A friend was arrested for a serious crime involving an underage individual. I also engaged in an intimate encounter with someone I did not like while being heavily intoxicated. Story 57. When my ex-father-in-law murdered my mother. He was a heavy drinker. My mother had just suffered a stroke, and he was supposed to take care of her since they lived in a different state than I did. One night, he got extremely drunk and strangled her. He tried to play it off as her passing in her sleep until 2 years later when her death was reopened, and they found evidence of bruising on her neck. I served 6 years in prison for assault with a deadly weapon against him. When the case was reopened and he was charged, they sent him to jail, but he somehow managed to secure a high bond. His sister bailed him out. I flew out there to collect the rest of my mother's belongings, thinking he was still in jail. I met him at his front door, not knowing he was there. He slammed the door in my face, and when that happened, I ran to my truck, grabbed my .357 Magnum, and shot into his door, window, garage, and even tried to get into his house. I was determined to kill him. I learned the hard way, thanks to the police showing up not even 10 minutes later. This was well over 25 years ago, and to this day, I would kill him if I ever had the chance. Story 58. Facing unexpected expenses can lead to a moment of panic and the realization that financial stability has been compromised. Story 59. On January 12, 2020, I noticed everyone in my town was sick with this really bad cold, and China had something called coronavirus. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.